Well, hello everyone, and welcome to this new video in which we continue discussing what we owe to each other by TM Scanlon, and we are going to finish the sixth chapter, which is this chapter that covers the concept of responsibility. We already started this last time, and we already made a video on responsibility, in which we explained, what Scanlon means by responsibility and why do we value responsibility. Why do we want to be responsible for our actions? And that's because, well, when you are responsible, we also have the opportunity to make choices. And we want to be able to make choices. We value choice. And so Scanlon explained what is so valuable about choice. Why do we want to always be able to make choices? And if you cannot make any choice, well, you cannot be held responsible for anything that you do. And we've seen two main theories of choice. One is the value of choice theory, which means that we must just provide people the opportunity to be able to make choices. And there is another view which called the four-feature view, which means that what we really want is to be able to consent to whatever agreement or to whatever action that we did. What matters for the four-feature view is if an act was done voluntarily. And Scanlon is more on the side of the first one. What matters is that we provide people with the conditions so that they can make their choices, and so we don't really need to add another condition, like the condition of voluntariness, in order for someone to be responsible for their own for their actions. And we also talked about, we mentioned that there are two kinds of responsibility: substantive responsibility and attributive responsibility. And we are going to talk about those today. And we are going to start with talking about moral appraisal. Like in what circumstances can we criticize someone morally, and how should the criticism be done? And is there a distinction between morally blaming someone and sanctioning someone or punishing someone? So here we are going to be talking about that. Now, when we say moral criticism, we mean that in a neutral way. It's a neutral term, like it can be appraisal or blame. So when we talk about moral blame or appraisal or criticism in general, we mean moral evaluation to decide if the act is morally neutral. Maybe morality doesn't apply to that act, or if it is moral and so it deserves to be praised, or if it is condemnable. So if moral appraisal applies to the choices one makes, then moral criticism can only be possible if one is responsible for their choices. So responsibility has to be a precondition for moral appraisal. I can only praise or condemn someone morally only if that person is responsible for those actions. So here we look at the conditions in which moral criticism is suspended and when it is legit. So a good thing to start with is to establish what we mean by moral criticism. And Scanlon says that there is a definition that is common, which says that since morality is about a system of restraints that we accept in order to get protection from harm, for example, like I give away some of my freedom for security. So we can say that moral criticism is about when someone fails at abiding by those restraints. It's basically telling someone that they did something wrong, means that they did something that they normally shouldn't have been part of the freedom that was given away. When someone assaults me, they give themselves a freedom that normally they shouldn't have. The deal was you cannot assault people anymore in exchange for security. But this view is misleading for Scanlon. I mean, this definition can be misleading. When we are talking about right and wrong, we are not talking about trading some freedom over security. Instead, he argues, and this is a quote, "This part of morality is not fundamentally a mechanism of control and protection, but rather what I call a system of co-deliberation. And moral reasoning is an attempt to work out principles that each of us could be asked to employ as a basis for deliberation and accept as a basis of criticism." So, moral criticism, when it is restricted to what we owe to each other, remember that Scanlon makes this distinction between morality in the broader sense and there is morality in a narrow sense, and he focuses on this narrow sense of what we owe to each other. And so he says that moral criticism, isn't really about telling other people that they misbehaved, but rather it's a cooperative attempt at arriving at principles which we cannot reject. Actions that are wrong are not an occasion for reminding people of their place or to punish them, but it's an opportunity to re-examine our principles and think of maybe we need new ones. Okay, so talking about security is not insignificant, since security is needed in order to be able to deliberate with others, but security is just one condition for the actual process of morality. Like it's not really its goal. So what matters in moral appraisal is to see whether or not someone's action is in harmony or disharmony with principles that we cannot reject. So when someone does something bad, they had a faulty behavior. The moral system of co-deliberation calls on this person to either prove that the action she performed is actually in harmony with principles that cannot be rejected, or admit that she did something wrong and her self-governance was made in a faulty way. So more precisely, we judge the person's self-governance, and Scanlon insists here on distinguishing that from a faulty conduct. When we criticize morally someone, we're not just pointing at the fact that they didn't act accordingly to a principle that they cannot reject, but also why they didn't act in that way. So their reasons matter and can even make the criticism invalid, despite that they did something wrong. So, in order for the criticism to be valid, the person who did wrong must have acted in that way while knowing that the principle couldn't be rejected. If they wanted to do something but they knew that the principle wouldn't allow that course of action and they do it anyways, then they are open to moral criticism. But if they did because they were mistaken about the principle or they failed to consider a relevant reason in their practical reasoning, then they're either not open to moral criticism or not in the same way as in the first case. So moral criticism here will also depend on the reasons they had to explain their failure. Now, failing to see a reason because you were sleepwalking is very different from failing because you were indifferent to that reason, right? So clearly you see the distinction between judging someone on their self-governance and judging someone on their conduct. In the first case, we ask for the reasons. In the other case, we don't look for reasons. We just say that that's a faulty conduct, that's a faulty behavior, and so case closed. So it's also important to note, as Scanlon did in a footnote, that you can also be open to moral criticism for doing the right thing if it was for the wrong reasons. And the way we express moral criticism can also be subject to moral criticism too. Like we've seen earlier, we've seen last time about the legal system, for example, that punishment is not moral criticism, and when people confuse both, that leads to disastrous effects. So Scanlon here is arguing for a conception of morality that either doesn't consider social sanctions or that punishment has to be justified on principles that cannot be rejected, which I don't think you ever can justify that, but instead he argues for a morality that would make people self-governing through the force of their reason, like being convinced of the principle is what is aimed at here. So if we punish someone who is not convinced or they don't have proper chance of deliberating for their own cause or for their own case, then we're not solving any problem. As he says, When I say that an act is wrong, if it would be disallowed by any principles for the general regulation of behavior that no one suitably motivated could reasonably reject, the general regulation that is in question is, in the first instance, each person's regulation of his or her own conduct through reflective self-governance, not regulation by the application of social sanctions. So, how can we do that? What is the power of moral criticism to make people responsible for their own general regulation? Or to put it another way, how can moral criticism make people self-governing? And here Scanlon says that we should start by looking at guilt. Like, guilt first implies that one accepts a negative evaluation of oneself, but we have to distinguish a negative evaluation in the sense of guilt from shame. Shame too is a negative evaluation, but guilt is narrower than shame. Guilt is self-reproach. Like in shame, you can have a negative evaluation of yourself without holding yourself responsible for it. Like, you are ashamed of your nose, or maybe there's something shameful within your family, etc. These can be bad, but they are not grounds for blaming yourself. In guilt, however, you blame yourself for that negative evaluation. As he says, quote, this is the attitude of taking one's rational self-governance to have been faulty and recognizing that some judgment-sensitive attitude must be modified or taken back. Self-reproach is thus applicable only to one's judgment-sensitive attitudes, that is to say, only to things one is responsible for in the broad sense. But here we need to explain we need to be even narrower, because not all reasons for self-reproach are also reasons for guilt. For example, making errors in math isn't a reason to feel guilty, depending on the context, of course. I can feel guilty by failing my exam because my Asian father had such high hopes for me. In guilt, we're talking about a specific kind of self-reproach. We're talking about moral reproach. In other words, I feel guilty because I violated principles that specify what I owe to others. It makes sense, after all, since when we feel guilty, we look for forgiveness from others. If the forgiveness comes from other people, then we certainly did something that violates what we owe to them. Then, on this account, the wrongfulness of an action isn't that it caused harm, but rather, as Scanlon says, the agent's mode of self-governance have ignored or flouted requirements flowing from another person's standing as someone to whom justification is owed. So, when someone does something wrong, let's say someone does something wrong to me, what they did was wrong because they didn't consider the reasons that I have for not wanting to be treated that way. And so now the wrongdoer owes me a justification. And so this explains why we feel resentment when someone wrongs us, and why we feel indignation when we witness someone doing wrong deeds, and not just anger or dismay. What happens is that by doing something wrong, you have acted in a way that is contrary to the things I value. It's like ignoring or dismissing the things that I consider valuable. Stealing is an example. You take away something that has value for someone else, and that is wrong because you neglected their reasons for holding on to that thing. But it's not just that you fail to respond to the reasons why. For example, I value the watch that my father left me after his death. It's not just about the value of the objects that get violated, but also my own value as a rational creature, or a reasonable creature. You acted as if being a creature that has reasons doesn't matter to you, that a human being doesn't matter to you. And so giving this, it would mean that for such person to be submitted to moral criticism, it then means that this person is a rational creature too, which means that they are capable of self-governance. They could regulate their conduct in ways that they don't, so that they won't have to treat us badly. Since we know that they're capable of this, since I know that the person who stole the watch that my father left me is a reasonable creature, then I know that they can change their behavior. And so we are justified in asking why they didn't change their behavior, why they stole in the first place. As such, moral criticism has only two limitations. First, it implies first that moral criticism applies only to rational creatures, since only they are capable of the kind of reflective self-governance in question. Second, it applies to them only in regard to their judgment-sensitive attitudes. That is, those attitudes that in a rational creature should be under the control of reason. So, if someone does something wrong to you, we can only morally criticize them if they are capable, as Scanlon says, of reflective self-governance, meaning they need to have the cognitive abilities to understand moral judgments and are capable of acting accordingly to those judgments. And so the second limitation is important because it holds that when we morally criticize the judgment-sensitive attitudes, meaning that that you cannot criticize someone else than that, the attitudes that are under the control of reason. So if the agent has an attitude that is not sensitive to his judgments, then that attitude is not under the control of reason, and so you cannot ask of him why you did that. So he says it's like asking someone, why are you tall? So the only thing that we have to ask, the only appropriate thing regarding moral criticism, is asking the agent to defend a judgment-sensitive attitude and nothing else. But this, however, doesn't mean, again, that an agent cannot be morally responsible for unconscious thoughts. If your attitude is sensitive to unconscious judgments, you are still required to provide a justification for them. If I am acting on an unconscious bias, for example, that is harmful to others, I am morally open to criticism because, being a rational creature, I have failed to see that those biases are harmful to people. So my attitude is still sensitive to my judgments, and so I am held responsible for unconscious thoughts if they are affecting my attitude. Let's consider an unsettling case about irrationality. What about an attitude that is contrary to someone's judgment? Here, Scanlon borrows from Thomas Nigel by quoting him. He says, "A person may be greedy, envious, cowardly, cold, ungenerous, unkind, vain, or conceited, but behave perfectly by a monumental effort of will. To possess these vices is to be unable to help having certain feelings under certain circumstances, and to have strong, spontaneous impulses to act badly. Even if one controls the impulses, one still has the vice." And so this is a complicated case. We have someone who has vices, but controls them by the effort of his will. So for Scanlon, these are instances of irrationality. This is like the person who is always seeking the attention of others, but knows that that's not a good thing, and dismisses these cravings by the power of his will. But he is still seeking it, right? Like if you look at it the other way, like let's say you have all of the virtues, like your impulses are generosity or temperance, but through a force of will you can control them in order to steal, to be angry all the time, to never give to charity. Like here the irrationality is obvious, right? So what do we do with this? Can a person like this be open to moral criticism? And so the challenge seems to be like this. On the one hand, we can say that the person is not open for moral criticism because they are perfectly fine. I mean, they are behaving perfectly. They may have the urges to act badly, but they see and understand that it is wrong, and so they control their attitude. But on the other hand, this person also thinks that acting badly is valid too. If the urge is too strong to the point of requiring a huge effort of will to overcome it, it means that the individual has many reasons in favor of acting badly. So apparently, being greedy or thinking about his interest above anyone else, and that he thinks it's a good thing or has too many reasons to think like it's worth considering to this extent, is also attributable to him. And so, on this account, the agent is open to moral criticism. And this is clearly an instance of irrationality as defined by Scanlon. Irrationality is not when our reasoning or rational capacities are overtaken by some weird and unconscious power like desire. It's when our rational capacities are in conflict. It's when we can attribute to someone two judgments or two tendencies that are in conflict, and the person cannot seem to easily choose between the two. In the case of the person in Nigel's case, he has two conflicting judgments. One that tells him that he can hurt others, and another that tells him that it is wrong. And so the person is able to correct or modify such judgments, and they are only in conflict because he's failing to do so. He's failing to see that the reasons he has for hurting others are not good reasons. At all. Like he needs to do a tremendous effort, to convince himself not to follow those vices. And so, whatever it is that is making him blind to this, if it's not, threatening his capacities to modify or correct his behavior or correct his thoughts, then they are still morally open to criticism. They are struggling with that, but they are capable of doing it. So the conclusion is that the agents have governed themselves well in dealing with these tendencies, but they would be better people if they did not have them at all. And so this is about whether or not the attitudes, thoughts, biases, or whatever in question are attributable to the agent or not. It's about whether or not they are unconscious, or let's say, not unconscious, but if the agent has an actual, power over them or not, if they are attributable to the agent. Now, there are other cases where moral criticism is debatable whether or not it is appropriate. In the case of guilt, that people feel when they do something wrong, but it is, but it is something, necessary. Are they, open to moral criticism? And so here, like we can ask first if the guilt is justified. Like this, should this person feel guilty? So those who answer yes to that question are probably partisans of what we call the desert thesis, and it's defined by Scanlon as, quote, the idea that when a person has done something that is morally wrong, it is morally better that he or she should suffer some loss in consequence. So here, guilt is a desert entailing notion. Now, Scanlon is categorical that he doesn't defend the desert thesis because it's a thesis that is radically incompatible with the causal thesis, since it doesn't take into consideration for moral argument any of the outside factors or forces operating through us. And so this led Scanlon to call right away the desert thesis morally indefensible, and many philosophers who want to defend it have to defend a weaker version of this thesis, or a revisionist position. Scanlon mentions, for example, the philosopher J.J.C. Smart as a leading example. So a revisionist position is basically when you say that maybe we got things wrong, and so it's better that we revise our work. So when we say that guilt is a desert entailing notion, clearly that would lead to a strong incompatibility with the causal thesis that even a hardcore believer in free will cannot hold. And so we need to revise what we thought about guilt. So let's see what is Smart revisionist thesis. So for him, moral criticism has two components. First, there has to be a dispraise of something in the agent, and then a provisio that indicates that the thing dispraised is the agent's responsibility, meaning that they can change or modify it once they are exposed to the unwelcome evaluation. So when I say to someone, you're ugly, it is not moral criticism, since it is not the agent's responsibility to change or modify how they look. But when I say you are mean or greedy, then I am giving an unwelcome evaluation that suggests that the agent must change their behavior, and it is in their power to do so. And so while this may look like Scanlon's criticism of judgment-sensitive attitudes, it has two major differences. First, Smart seems to suggest that moral criticism is exactly like criticizing someone's appearance or talent, but with a proviso that it's the individual's power to change that. And so this would make moral criticism to apply to even appearance and talent, because, well, that too is in the individual's power to be changed or modified, right? But clearly, those things that when we criticize and even when they are in the individual's power to change are not moral things. They cannot be criticized on moral grounds unless they are somehow going to affect my relationship with others, in the sense that I'd be violating a principle that I owe to them. So even if there is something wrong with my face that I can change, not changing it would not violate a principle of what I owe to others. So it shouldn't affect my relationships with people on a moral level. Like we said earlier, that when I make a mistake in mathematics, it makes me open to criticism, but it doesn't make me open to moral criticism. So moral criticism isn't like any other criticism that is about sanctioning a behavior. Like when we feel bad when we do something wrong, that discomfort isn't something that is inflicted on you by something other than the wrongdoing itself. As he says, although awareness of one's moral faults is uncomfortable, this discomfort is intrinsic to an awareness of the faults involved, not something that is assigned to them in order to serve some purpose, such as retaliation or enforcement. So, to go back to the question about whether someone has to feel guilty for doing something wrong, but necessary, well, clearly, no, they don't have to, in the sense that they must feel guilty in order for another party to feel happy or something. If I killed someone's brother because we were both drowning and there was only one life jacket, we can debate whether or not that's a wrong thing. But if I have to feel guilty so that you can get some sort of retaliation, then it means that even though I have good reasons not to feel guilty, you'd still try to force me to feel, guilty. So if you're going to morally criticize someone, you have to do it only to make them aware of the faultiness or wrongness of their actions, not to get some sort of satisfaction or revenge. Since that desire of revenge or satisfaction is separate from the actual criticism, it has no role to play in moral criticism. And this is why the desert thesis fails. It's because it lies on the idea that when someone does something bad, it's a good thing for them to suffer, which isn't a matter of moral criticism. Moral criticism is not about whether or not it's a good thing for a wrongdoer to suffer, but it's about asking for justification. It's about questioning the reasons that the agent had to do what they did. So attitudes that are open to moral criticism entail neither that it is good to make the agent to whom these attitudes are attributed suffer, nor as explained in a footnote, a partial withdrawal of goodwill and making it okay to harm that person. Whether or not the agent must suffer is a whole other question that would be extremely difficult to answer in a coherent way. If you say that yes, they have to suffer. So this doesn't mean that there cannot be responses to a wrongdoing other than moral criticism. We can demand for an apology, or that the wrongdoer does something humiliating, or even cutting ties with the person and avoid that person altogether. The point, however, is that these reactions are not moral criticism, but they are of course subject to moral criticism too. It would be morally wrong to ask for someone to humiliate themselves because they committed a very minor wrongdoing, for example. These reactions must be appropriate to the moral criticism, meaning that they don't undo what was pointed out in the criticism. In short, they cannot hinder the chances or opportunity for the wrongdoer to change their behavior or their attitude. So these reactions do presuppose a certain degree of free will, but not to the point of being incompatible with the causal thesis, as like, for example, the desert thesis. And so hence we arrive at the second problem that Scanlon finds in Smart's approach. Smart takes it that in order to be able to criticize someone, it has to be about attitudes that they can modify. Since Smart believes in free will, then he'd argue that only modifiable behavior can be open to moral criticism. But according to Scanlon, quote, this will not always be true. Some judgment-sensitive attitudes may be unmodifiable. I believe, as I will explain in section 5, that moral criticism can still be applicable in such cases. And so we can turn right now to section 5 to see what he's talking about here. So now we turn to the fifth section of the chapter, which is about the preconditions for moral appraisal, meaning the conditions under which the forms of appraisal and blame that we defined so far are applicable. So this is where the notion of freedom has its most important role. Like, in order for the appraisal to take place, we have to determine whether or not the agent was free in his or her action. Now, what do we mean by free? Well, Scanlon gives three conditions. The first one is that the action must be attributable to the agent, and so this doesn't mean that someone else did the action and I got the blame, but if I was the one in control of myself when the action occurred. If I did something while someone else, for example, was stimulating my brain, the action cannot be attributed to me. Or if I was sleepwalking, for example. These cases cannot be appropriate for moral appraisal because, quote, they break the usual connection between the action and the judgment-sensitive attitudes of the agent as a participant in moral relations. So, this is more precise because this offers a clear definition of what we mean by someone who has control over himself. It simply means that the action performed is in relation to the agent judgment-sensitive attitude. So if I have a certain judgment and my body acts accordingly to that judgment, then the action is attributable to me. In other words, without those judgments being mine, I simply become a puppet, a tool for someone else's judgments. If I am unconscious and someone takes my hand, now of course unconscious means that you, in this context, it means that you don't have any control over your judgment sensitive thoughts. Okay, so if I am unconscious in that definition, and someone takes my hand, he puts a gun in it and presses my fingers, and they pull the trigger, the shooting cannot be attributed to me. And so it wouldn't make sense to ask me to justify the shooting. And so the same also applies when someone forces thoughts into my brain by implementing them. Whether or not the action was good, the fact that it was implanted in me by someone else makes it inappropriate to praise me morally. So what's interesting is that Scanlon argues that implemented thoughts can lead to genuine intentions, but because they are implanted, they are not attributable to the agent. So having the intention of doing something doesn't mean that the action is actually attributable to you. So for Scanlon, this is because what will determine the attribution is whether or not the action can be justified by the agent, in the sense that the agent can think of judgments that can justify the action. If I suddenly get the urge of eating ice cream because someone is playing with my brain, that someone can make me have the intention to eat the ice cream. But if the intention was created or implemented by someone else, then just having the intention isn't enough to make me, fit for moral criticism. And so instead, the best indicator for an action that it is attributable to the agent is to let the agent present the judgments they can think of to justify the action. We ask what judgments made you think doing that action was a good idea, or to put it differently, what reasons did you have for doing that action? And so by asking for the reasons an agent has, we can avoid the kind of determinism that makes all moral appraisal inappropriate, because, as Scanlon says, moral appraisal is not rendered inappropriate in such cases by the mere fact that a person's action or attitude has a causal explanation. Being a rational creature is a matter of having a coherent psychology of a certain kind. So the reasons that we have are causal explanations, since they are the causes for our actions, but it doesn't mean that an agent cannot be called to justify their actions. What is needed is just for the agent to have psychological coherence and the ability to establish a, quote, stable and coherent connection between what one says, does, and how things seem to one at one time, and what one says, does, and how things seem to one at later times. And so in this sense, what distinguishes the cases of someone stimulating my brain, or sleepwalking, or hypnosis from cases where actions are attributable to an agent is what this connection, whether or not this connection is severed. That's why someone who acts under the influence of drugs, for example, or is mentally ill or have brain damage, are less likely to have their actions attributed to them. And so these are what we call cases of innocent agents. An agent is innocent if the action they performed doesn't reflect their judgment-sensitive attitude. This, of course, will depend on how we identify the agent. And so this is the second category where moral appraisal is appropriate, which is based on the character of the action, which can change depending on the circumstances. So here, quote, rather than blocking altogether the attribution of an action or attitude to an agent, these conditions alter the character of the action that can be attributed. So if I know someone who was nice to everyone, but after an accident they become mean, we wouldn't change our opinions about them at first. We'd understand that given the accident that this person been in, she won't be able to be nice anymore, but this will depend on whether the accident is either making a rupture between her behavior and her judgments, or if her judgments change after the accident. In the first case, she's innocent, but in the latter, she's kind of open to moral criticism. There can also be a transition phase where at first, under the trauma and the shock of being in an accident, she gets in a fight or flight kind of situation where her attitude cannot be sensitive to her judgments. But then, if this drags for too long, then she's probably sensitive to her judgments. So if she's still mean to people, then the accident must have changed her. Like now, she just has other judgments that provide her reasons to be mean now. In such cases, we can understand what the person is going through, but she's not innocent anymore, or so. And so we can ask of her to justify her behavior. We can say something like, she used to be so wonderful, but after the accident, she became a nasty person. So this, of course, will depend on her reasons and her knowledge of the situation. If someone steps on my foot, I can get mad at them, but if their reasons to step on my foot was that they didn't see me standing near to them, or maybe they saw, I don't know, a tow spider on my foot, and they mistook it for an actual poisonous spider, and felt that they have to act quickly, then their action is mistaken, but they have reasons for it. As such, we can point to their mistakes, but we cannot say that they are morally blamable. And so these are cases in which the action is attributed to the agent, but doesn't mean that moral criticism necessarily applies. Someone may have acted hastily, or they acted in a rush, and they can be responsible for that action, but their heart is in the right place, for example. When someone acts under a threat or coercion, for example, they can be responsible, like when someone in a bank gives the money to a robber who's pointing a gun at him, but that's not an act that is open to moral criticism, even though you are responsible for it. So Scanlon holds that we don't have to make the case that actions like these are involuntary in order to spare the agent of moral criticism. People who are responsible for their action or act voluntarily doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't necessarily make them proper targets for moral criticism. The bank teller, for example, who gave the money, did act voluntarily, handing over the cash to the bank. To the bank robber was his full responsibility. We cannot say that handing the cash wasn't his own action. If we do, then we claim that whatever it is that we wouldn't have chosen if there was no other force that pressured us cannot be attributed to us, which of course is kind of false. Saying that you cannot attribute to me handing over the cash because I wouldn't have done it if I didn't have a gun pointed at my face, that's kind of fallacious and unnecessary to maintain that the person who handed the money is innocent. Think of the famous example given by Aristotle, for example, and Scanlon mentions this example. It's about sailors who throw away the cargo because the ship is sinking. In the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle gives that example while saying that it's a strange case because it has elements of voluntary action and also involuntary action, but overall he argues that it is a voluntary action nonetheless because, quote, the origin of the action is within the agent. And in the same footnote, Scanlon also mentions Bernard Williams. He takes on the example and he says that although the act wasn't entirely free, the sailors still chose to throw away the cargo. So just because an action is voluntary and it's your responsibility and choice, it doesn't mean that it's a free action and therefore you can be exempted from moral criticism for a voluntary action. It's just not a blameworthy action. So some philosophers would, for example, say no, like Harry Frankfurt, who is also mentioned in the next footnote, who defines coercion as a person who is coerced is compelled to do what he does. He has no choice but to do it. This is at least part of what is essential if coercion is to relieve its victim of moral responsibility. If it is to make it inappropriate either to praise or to blame him for having done what he was coerced into doing. So for Frankfurt, a coercion raises such a fear of penalty within the agent that they act in such a way to avoid the penalty at all costs, and therefore this would make them act in ways that is contrary to their judgment-sensitive attitude, and so this would make coercion cases like cases of the first category in Scanlon's argument. The example of the bank teller would certainly fit this definition of Frankfurt on coercion. But as Scanlon notes, these would be very rare examples of coercion. Not all coercion works like that. It seems that Frankfurt is just disagreeing on terminological points with Scanlon. If some cases would lead to such conclusions, then we'd consider those cases to be, part of the first category. But most cases of coercion or duress fit more in the second category. So the first category is about whether or not we can attribute an action to someone, and the second is whether or not the action is blameworthy. And so now we can move to the third category, which is in which moral blame is inappropriate, is that in which a person lacks the general capacities presupposed by moral agency. So this means that we are talking about a person who is incapable of partaking in the process of co-deliberation, like period. And so being unable to do that, these people have to be dealt with like animals, meaning that if you remember the categories of beings to whom we owe justifications, this would make them a category 2. Now that's from the section, the scope of morality, in the 4th chapter of wrongness and reasons. So we're not talking about mistreating them when Scanlon says that they have to be dealt with like we do with animals, or at least with small children. Kids, after all, are never blameworthy. They are never blameworthy precisely because they fit in these categories. We cannot attribute actions to them. If a child acts in a greedy way, we cannot say that they are a greedy person. To attribute an action means that the agent has a judgment about that action, and well, kids can't be really expected to form judgment-sensitive attitudes. That's why we blame adults when their children misbehave. We attribute the misbehavior of children to the parents. And second, since they cannot understand the consequences of their actions, it's inappropriate to blame them on the grounds of, well, the second category. And because they cannot be expected to explain themselves, they cannot be expected to partake or to participate in co-deliberation, and that would be the third category. So these are the three categories in which moral criticism is appropriate. Action is attributed to individual, the character of the action, and then the capacities of for co-deliberation. Once the agent responds positively to these categories, we can morally appraise him or blame them. Moral criticism. Now that we have established that, let's move to the more controversial issue. That is the issue of freedom, because some people can see how Scanlon contractualism can still claim to freedom with the causal thesis, and also it's kind of a deterministic kind of way to look at human beings. So let's see what it's all about. So if to be free means that we have judgment-sensitive attitudes, we can just say that those attitudes are caused by external forces. And so what proves to us that the question becomes what proves to us that these attitudes are really ours and not those of someone else? What makes judgment-sensitive attitudes the proof of self-governance? Why can't we say that judgment-sensitive attitudes are also things that have been implanted, and not by other agents, but for example by our environment, by circumstances, or material conditions? And so Scanlon defines self-governance like this. He says, a person governs herself in the sense required if she is sensitive to the force of reasons and to the distinctions and relations between them, and if her response to these reasons generally determines her subsequent attitudes and actions. But if that's the case, then we can say that a computer also governs itself, since a computer fits that definition. So does that mean that we can hold a computer morally responsible for what it is doing? Well, of course not. But that's not because Scanlon is wrong, but because even if we do the same things as a computer, that doesn't mean that we do it in the same way as a computer. Despite the fact that we operate like computers, we communicate in ways that the computer doesn't, like communicating on moral terms, which influence our behavior in ways that are alien to a computer. In other words, we do what a computer does, but to judgment-sensitive attitudes which a computer cannot do. So self-governance regards creatures that are capable of forming judgment-sensitive attitudes. Computers, they do think like we do, but they don't form judgment-sensitive attitudes. A computer, for example, isn't going to have a personal moral attitude or or a moral judgment. It can, like in the case of ChatGPT, reflect moral opinions, but those are the opinions of its creators, not itself, and so they cannot be attributed to it. Also, the computer is not conscious, or at least in the way human beings are conscious, even if an AI, an artificial intelligence, can talk like a human being. We can have a conversation with it in which we communicate like we would with a human. We can do that with ChatGPT, but it doesn't mean that ChatGPT is understanding what we are saying or even what it is saying. ChatGPT isn't aware of the message going in and out of it, or at least yet. Who knows what the future holds. So as Scanlon says, what does matter is that we are conscious and that the truth of the causal thesis would not alter that fact. So let's ask why the causal thesis doesn't alter the fact that we are conscious and that we are responsible for our actions within the limits of the three categories mentioned. And so to answer that, let's recap what the causal thesis is, what it is about, and what does it say exactly. It claims that it is unfair to criticize people because the things that they do come from an external forces that makes it unavoidable to do those things. So whether they want it or not, people will do what they are caused to do. And so in this sense, the causal thesis would argue that no action can be attributable to an agent, since whatever the judgment-sensitive attitude that they have, it will not depend on their judgment, but whatever caused that judgment. And those are things that are outside of the agent's control. There's a philosopher that Scanlon mentions here that defends such views, and her name is Susan Wolf. And she gives the following case. Imagine a woman who walks in a bookstore. There she sees a book that a very close friend of hers wants, and normally would expect the woman to buy the book for her friend. But in this thought experiment, the woman, because of her personality and social development, is too self-centered for the thought, my friend would love it if I get this book to her. She's too self-centered for that thought to even occur to her. Like it just doesn't come to her mind, or maybe she's just so unfamiliar with instances of sincere and non-instrumental friendships that, the thought I should buy this book just to make my friend happy, it seems so irrational to her. Even if the thought comes to her mind, the thought seems just too irrational, and so she won't. She wouldn't buy the book. And so this is akin to cases where someone, because of a traumatic or abusive childhood, doesn't see any reason not to exploit others for their own advantage. And so according to Wolf, moral criticism, morally criticize these people would be unfair because, quote, the agents lack the ability to appreciate the reasons for treating others better, and they therefore cannot be properly blamed for what they do. But this is not really what constitutes a charge of unfairness. Rather, Scanlon argues that there has to be two conditions to say that a situation is unfair. First, there is accuracy. It's unfair to morally criticize these people because we don't have accurate knowledge about them. We don't know about their childhood, for example, and if we judge someone without an an accurate account of who they are, we can dismiss important information about them that would make them seem not as bad as they are. So on this account, the woman in the bookstore is not a bad person who doesn't care about her friend, but rather she is trying her best, giving her personality and circumstances, to be a good friend in her own bizarre way. But this doesn't make sense for Scanlon. The reason why the woman doesn't consider the reason for buying her book, for buying her friend the book, is because she's too self-centered, and that is definitely not an argument to spare her moral criticism. Quite the contrary, actually. Clearly, that woman can figure out what is the best thing to do. It's not that she's trying. It's not that she's trying hard to figure out what is best, what is the best thing to do towards her friend, but she's just bad at it. Like, you know, she can figure it out, and even if she's struggling to figure it out on her own, well, moral criticism is precisely here to help her figure out what she is missing. Like, the problem is probably, as Scanlon said earlier, that moral criticism is not about punishment, and I think a lot of people think that it is, that moral criticism is about ostracizing or inflicting harm on people instead of being a tool to help each other figure out, you know, what's the right thing to do. So, on Scanlon's account, the woman is not oblivious to pleasing her friend because she is self-centered. It's actually the other way around. She's self-centered because she doesn't consider pleasing her close friend. She doesn't consider pleasing her close friend something that is important, something that a friend should do, and that can be fixed with moral criticism, as it will show her the reasons for considering pleasing your close friends, and that is, you know, something that is important. You know, it's important to consider pleasing your close friends. And this is just a case of a woman not buying a book to her friend, but what happens when it is a fucked up criminal who commits huge crimes? The fact that we can understand where they are coming from, like, you know, their background and all of that, and we can have compassion, doesn't mean that moral criticism is, you know, invalid, or that they are not open to moral criticism. If we consider the criminal as a victim of his childhood, we'll then be saying that moral criticism is inappropriate because we cannot attribute to him his actions. You know, that's the first category. And people who defend this line of reasoning defend what Scanlon calls in a footnote the doctrine of original innocence. Like, we are originally innocent, but outside factors, well, they corrupt us. Now, to be fair, Wolf doesn't defend this doctrine, as explained in the footnote, but she has in mind another similar view called the real self view, where we basically can only blame someone for an action if the action reveals their true selves. Just to clarify. But anyways, the point is we have an original innocence doctrine here, and Scanlon doesn't find it compelling. The problem with that view is that it claims that we are criticizing the person as a whole. And that is why it wants to appeal to an original self, or to a real, true agent that is beneath all of the external factors that made them what and who we are and who they are. But as Scanlon says, when we morally criticize a person, we're not judging them for who they become, but for what they did at specific instances. Like, that's not how the innocent case works. We're not saying that someone is responsible for who they become or for who they are as a whole. You know, that would be a whole different question. We're simply concerned with what we are concerned with is simply whether or not the individual can form a judgment-sensitive attitude and provide reasons for their actions that we cannot reject on reasonable grounds. We're just asking if their behavior at that moment is the result of a faulty self-governance. If there's something in the childhood of the person that would make them unable to form judgment-sensitive attitudes, then we can argue that they are not open to moral criticism. But surely not every bit of information about the life of someone is relevant to assess whether or not they are open to moral criticism. So that's for the accuracy aspect of the charge of unfairness. And there's another aspect. The second aspect that Scanlon raises is the opportunity aspect of the charge. This can be framed as the claim that it is unfair to blame a person for acting in a certain way if he or she has not had adequate opportunity to avoid this condemnation. Now, it is true that Scanlon argued about this when we dealt with the legal system. If someone does something that he had no opportunity to avoid, then they can't be morally open to criticism. However, as Scanlon says, in the case of the legal system, we're not talking about morality but sanction. In that case, it would make sense that if someone didn't have the opportunity to avoid performing a wrong action, they're not eligible for a sanction. But that doesn't mean that they are not eligible for moral criticism. So here, we're just concerned with the accurateness of the judgment X acted wrongly. Not that X should be punished, ostracized, exiled, or shunned, or whatever. But here, someone can object to this, saying that moral criticism isn't something that we just throw as if it has no consequences. People get punished as a result of moral criticism. So moral criticism, especially moral blame, isn't something that has no effects on the person being criticized. After all, moral criticism is normative. It seeks to modify a certain behavior. And so what happens when the person criticized doesn't want to change their behavior? Well, they get punished, you know? When we criticize someone and they don't change their behavior, what do? We don't even have to think to think to someone who is bad and out of ego that they resist, but simply because they genuinely don't see what is wrong with their behavior. What are we to do with them? If reason or deliberation doesn't seem to cut through to them, aren't we going to use other means to make the person, modify their behavior? If not punishment, then people would ostracize them whether there's a legal system or not. And so even if there is no subsequent consequence to the moral blame, the moral blame itself has effects on other people. As anyone who was criticized, anyone who had been criticized can know, the feeling that it is unpleasant, that when you morally blame someone, it's an unpleasant feeling, and it has to be. One way or another, moral blame must inflict some cost to the person being judged. And in a footnote, Scanlon mentions a philosopher who put this more directly. The philosopher's name is Gary Watson, and Scanlon quotes him. He says, "It is only insofar as and because blaming responses, at least potentially, affect the interests of their objects adversely that moral accountability raises the issue of avoidability that have been central to the traditional topic of moral responsibility." So, given that moral blame cannot be distinguished from negative effect, a certain cost that it there has to be, a certain cost that is, felt or imposed on the individual being judged. Then, if the person didn't have the opportunity to avoid committing that act, it is unfair to make them pay such cost. However, Scanlon says, why not? Why is it unfair to make someone pay for his behavior even though he didn't have the opportunity not to have that behavior? If by pay we also include shunning or avoiding that person, it doesn't seem unfair for me to avoid someone who has, serious issues going on. Like it would be unfair, as Scanlon points in a footnote, to withdraw all of my sympathies with gratuitous unpleasantness. Not all ways of moral criticism are warranted, of course, but it would actually be unfair to me to have to tolerate that person's pathological opportunism, for example. Like, I can understand and accept that his behavior is due to his childhood and that he didn't have the opportunity to be someone else, but I don't have to put up with it, right? So me ostracizing that person cannot be unfair. So apparently that person can, even though they've never had the opportunity in question, suffer some unpleasant responses from others. I don't see why they cannot suffer the unpleasantness of moral criticism, given that moral criticism is not only less unpleasant than being deprived of friends and cooperation, but also moral criticism itself is an opportunity for you to do otherwise. Right? Like, like you claim that you never had the opportunity to be nice, and so no one should morally blame you for being a shithead, but the moral blame is the opportunity for you not to be a shithead anymore. But even if moral criticism itself is the opportunity, we actually don't have to believe in that in order to hold someone accountable for something they didn't have the opportunity to avoid or the opportunity not to do. Yes, we also argued in the last video that people need to have opportunities to do otherwise if they want to have choices. We've seen that choice has three values, the symbolic, representative, and instrumental, and that people have good reasons to hold on to those. So clearly having the opportunity to do otherwise seems necessary to have choices, and this is what we argued for, but we didn't argue for the thesis that you must have opportunities and choices in order to be open to moral criticism. Like, being responsible through opportunity is not the only way for someone to be responsible for their action, but a way that is more spread and easier to defend. But what about the cases where this is not so? So can a person who doesn't have the opportunity to do otherwise still be open to moral criticism? And for Scanlon, the answer is yes. Remember, in the previous video on this chapter, we said the belief that you can only be responsible for things you had the opportunity to do differently is called a substantive responsibility. We used, for example, the example of the father who did not set up his estate, and so his son wasted the money. If the son didn't have the opportunity not to waste the money, then it is the father's responsibility to set up his estate. That's a substantive responsibility, and therefore the son is exempted from it. And so only those who have the opportunity to do otherwise can be held responsible in this definition. So for a responsibility to be effective, the action must be attributed to the agent, and it must impose an obligation that we cannot reject. If one of these two conditions are not met, then the agent is not responsible. The son lost the money, that's attributable to him, but was the obligation to keep it something that he could perform? Did he have the opportunity to perform the obligation of keeping the money? And likewise, does the obligation on the father is the obligation of the father justified? Does the father have to set up his estate? Does he has the opportunity to perform that obligation? And more importantly, does he also have the opportunity to avoid that obligation if he doesn't want to set up his estate? In the case of the son, if the answer is no, then the son is not responsible, and if the answer is also no in the case of the father, then he's not responsible either. If both are coerced into either setting up the estate or keeping the money without the opportunity to do otherwise, then they had no choice. The burden was imposed on them. And so we can see this principle applied in other cases that make sense. For example, if you force me to make a promise, the promise cannot be binding because I accepted it under a threat. So I didn't have the opportunity to reject that obligation, an obligation that I didn't want. Or if I trespass on someone's property in order to save someone. If there is a principle that takes away the opportunity to save someone because it is illegal to trespass on some private property, then I cannot be responsible for not saving the other person. And we can reject a principle that restricts such opportunities. But here, there's again a confusion with the point of moral criticism. Moral criticism does indeed need the action to be attributable to the agent, but it doesn't say much about the burden it puts on the agent. Instead, its focus is to determine whether the action that is attributable to the agent is wrong. It doesn't care about whether we had the opportunity to do otherwise. The only reason we bring this The only reason why we bring this up is when there is a sanction or a burden that comes with the moral judgment. But as Scanlon says, the claim that an action is wrong should not be identified with the claim that imposing the burden of adverse moral judgment on the agent is justified. So indeed, these are two different things. Saying that an action is wrong is different from saying that the cost or burden that the moral judgment puts on the agent is justified. So if I say that trespassing a private property is wrong, this is different from saying that the trespasser must be punished. And also, the reason why we reject the principle that says that you cannot trespass on a private property, even to save someone's life, is not. It's not because, I mean, the reason why we reject this principle is not because the moral criticism is unfair. It's not the cost of the moral judgment that makes the principle rejectable. It's the cost of the principle itself. So you don't need to argue that the principle takes away some opportunity from me and makes criticism unfair to reject it. You can simply argue that the cost the principle imposes on me cannot be justified. So the conclusion is that for the claim that moral criticism is unfair, for that claim to be valid, it must show that the criticism itself is unfair, not the supposedly cost or consequences of the criticism. But then we're just back to the problem of accuracy, and we've already dealt with that. Still, some people can argue that if that is true, that moral criticism doesn't have a burden that comes with it, then what makes moral blame different from Smart's disapproval? Remember, Smart is the guy that argues that moral criticism are basically unwelcomed evaluation, like you're ugly, and so for a moral claim to have its normative force, a certain burden must come with it. So it cannot be like Scanlon says, just attributable to the self-governing individual. If moral claims don't come with a burden, then they are just aesthetic claims, and so nothing would compel people to be moral in that case. So we need burdens, but burdens must be justified. And what can justify a burden if it's not the opportunity for someone to do things differently? So if someone has no opportunity, then they cannot be open to moral criticism. And so this view is, however, mistaken, since we've already debunked Smart's view when we talked about the desert thesis. Scanlon already showed in what way moral criticism is different from aesthetic criticism, without appealing to a burden, but by appealing to the person's judgment-sensitive attitude and their revision or modification. And also, because the judgment-sensitive attitude involved in morality cannot be dissociated from my relations to others, what makes a creature a rational one is that it cannot only form judgment-sensitive attitudes, but also understand what those judgments imply for other people. It can understand how their judgments influence their behavior, which affects others and their relationships with others. And so what's actually demanded in moral criticism is to see whether or not the agent understands this in particular. If they can understand moral reasons against a certain action. If someone does something wrong because they didn't have the opportunity to do otherwise, it makes a difference if that person can understand moral reasons or moral reasoning or not, right? So, for example, if I was determined to kill someone, but at the same time I wanted to kill that person, like I was, for example, you are fated, you are determined, like you cannot avoid this. You cannot avoid to kill someone, but at the same time you wanted to kill that person, like you would really enjoy killing this person. You cannot say that I'm not open to moral criticism here. Like in being forced to commit a murder is something, but enjoying the murder, it's something else, right? So even if you were forced to kill someone, if you also enjoyed it, well, you can have some problems there. Huh? So if you bring me to court and the lawyers prove that I was acting because someone else was controlling my body, but I also enjoyed the feeling of when my hands were strangling the person that I killed, even if I couldn't have done otherwise, you are right to say, what the fuck, dude? You know, you are right to say, well, this person is open to moral criticism. And so let's consider this case. There's a case that Scanlon gives in the conclusion, but it can be better to examine it here. This is a case given by Harry Frankfurt, again, about two agents that are addicted to a drug. Like, they're full-on junkies and they cannot resist the temptation of consuming the drug. One of them is what Frankfurt calls an unwilling victim, which, if you remember in the first chapter in Frankfurt's terminology, it's a second order desire. It means that here the the addict doesn't want to have the desire to consume the drug. Okay, it is an unwilling addict. Okay, he doesn't want to consume the drug. The other, however, is a willing victim. Like, he wants to want the drug. He wants a life of drug addiction. And so, according to Frankfurt, then, when the willing addict takes the drug, he acts freely in the sense relevant to moral responsibility, despite his inability to act otherwise. The unwilling addict, on the other hand, is not free in the sense. So, this account is compatible with Scanlon's. The unwilling victim is doing an action that is contrary to his judgment-sensitive attitude, and therefore the act of consuming the drug cannot really be attributed to him. And so in this sense, the unwilling victim is not open to moral criticism. They already, they already agree, that it is bad that I'm taking the drug. So if we are going to do anything so that they, stop consuming the drug, it's not going to be on the grounds of moral criticism. This is probably someone who just has a disorder in their brain at this point. But the willing victim, however, is acting on his judgment-sensitive attitude, and so even if he cannot do otherwise but to consume the drug, well, he is still a free agent. His actions are attributable to him, and therefore he is open to moral criticism. He can be asked to defend his behavior. And so this just means that he can make a case for what reasons he has to indulge in addiction, and those reasons can have a moral force. He can make the argument that given that this is the only possible life for him, wanting it makes it less unbearable, for example, than not wanting it. And so it's important to remember that the point of criticism isn't to judge or blame, but give opportunity for an agent to make a case for their behavior on the grounds of moral reasons that we cannot reject. So the willing victim, by being willing, clearly has reasons for wanting this behavior. So he has to give them. And that's what moral criticism consists of. You can give reasons. Obviously, you have reasons for wanting to take the drug, even though you cannot avoid, taking it. And so you are responsible, and so you are open to moral criticism. You have to give the reasons, and we are going to see if they are, if we can reject them or not. And so it can be said that both of these addicts, whether willing or unwilling, would prefer a life without the addiction. So their willingness is made under coercive conditions, and so we can say that their choices are not free, like in the case of the sailors in Aristotle. But some disagree with this, and in a long footnote, Scanlon mentions Bernard Williams again, who makes a distinction between a freedom restricted by forces of nature and one by intentional agents. For Williams, the sailors, they acted freely because what made the ship sink was a force of nature. Given that nature isn't actively seeking of restricting your freedom, it's like an accident. Whereas in the example of the bank teller who has a gun pointed at him, here there is an active agent who is intentionally trying to restrict your freedom. And so this means that according to Williams, being free stands opposed above all to being in someone's power. So since there was no one actively trying to force you to take the drug, drug addiction is seen like a force of nature, right? And the relevance of this fact is, according to Williams, about whether or not someone is being treated unfairly by others. If someone is being treated unfairly by others, then we have to ask from those others to treat them fairly, because the unfairness and the restrictions that the agent is experiencing and that, quote, result from alterable human actions or institutions obviously have greater significance than those due to unalterable forces of nature. So, for Williams, the drug addicts, because no one forces them to take the drugs, are responsible for their actions and are therefore free, since they are under no one's power. And so Scanlon argues, he agrees with the fact that the drug dealers are responsible for their action and open to moral criticism, but he disagrees with Williams about the freedom part. For Scanlon, being free doesn't necessarily mean that you are responsible, because the notion of freedom presented by Williams has some unacceptable implications, at least for Scanlon. It means that when someone is being forced by other intentional people to do something bad, it is the duty of the intentional people to stop restricting the agent. If we have to help the agent overcome these obstacles, the people who put the obstacles in the first place must cooperate. But that obligation, that burden that you will put on those who force the agent to be bad, you can't put them on people who did nothing to the agent. Like, if I force someone to consume a highly addicted drug and this person now becomes an addict that steals and robs in order to buy the substance, then people would oblige me who made this individual an addict. People would oblige me to fix the problem, but they cannot oblige someone who did nothing to this agent to help them or to pay for his treatment, for example. But if we follow that path, then we also don't have to help anyone whose freedom is being restricted by forces of nature, since no one will be asked for to alter their behavior in that case. But we know that's not how things works. That's not how things work, unless you are a libertarian retard. When people suffer from natural forces, we still know that we owe them support and we owe them help and protection, even though we had nothing to do with their restricted freedom. So, since in every case we're still entitled to help from others, being responsible doesn't mean that we don't owe anything to these people either. The point of moral responsibility isn't to say that your fault, is not to say that it is your fault and leave you be, whether you are free or not. And so the substantive claim does get something right, that when someone doesn't have the opportunity for an alternative, that has to be taken into account. But not in the sense that would spare them moral criticism or responsibility. Like, framing the problem this way seems to depict a false dilemma. We're presented with the option that if we accept that someone is responsible, then we don't owe anything to them. If someone is responsible for their bad behavior, it means that we have no obligation to help them, but we're just not in a dilemma of you either have moral criticism or help others. Like, you can have both. You can be responsible for your actions, be open to moral criticism, and still be entitled to assistance, to welfare programs, to rehab centers and rehabilitation programs, to social safety nets, etc., and not, and not necessarily to punishment or to when we ostracize people, or to be completely abandoned. right? As Scanlon says, giving the pressure on a young person in his situation to take drugs and the difficulty of overcoming an addiction once it is established, it would be wrong to say that because he became and remained addicted voluntarily, the state has no duty to provide him with drug treatment or to ameliorate the conditions that led to such people's becoming addicted in the first place. So imagine someone who because of a horrible childhood and a horrible adolescence, grew up to be a compulsive, manipulative liar who's undisciplined and unreliable. Such person would probably never be able to hold a job since they barely show up to work and they never get their work done in time, etc. They'll end up probably unemployed all of their life, but that doesn't mean that they are not entitled to some help and support from the state or from their community. Just because your unemployability is the result of actions that you are responsible for, it doesn't mean that you have no right for welfare support. Quote, he is responsible, that is to say, open to criticism for these actions, but he cannot simply be left to bear the consequences since he has not had adequate opportunity to avoid being subject to them. So, since people can still be responsible and open to moral criticism, even if they didn't have the opportunity to do otherwise, we have to ask ourselves then, in what conditions moral criticism is inappropriate. It can be argued that the only way for moral criticism to be inappropriate is that the wrongdoer is indeed incapable of understanding moral reasoning. They just cannot be moved by moral reasons or moral arguments. For them, morality has no persuasive force whatsoever. Like they're not doing it on purpose. They just can't see the moral force of moral reasons. Whatever we try to, whatever we do in order to convince them. And so, as Scanlon writes, agents who are unable to see the force of moral reasons cannot be expected to revise their attitudes in response to such reasons. Therefore, it must be said, moral criticism that demands of them that they do this is unreasonable. But here, we can say that we've established 2 points of moral criticism. First, it determines whether or not an action was wrong, and then it determines whether or not the wrongdoer can understand why the action is wrong. And so this is like someone does something wrong and I morally criticize the action, and then I have to deliberate with the wrongdoer, and hopefully the wrongdoer would be capable of understanding the force of my moral criticism. Like he'd be capable of understanding that what he did was wrong and modify his attitude. Now, normally, any person who is capable of understanding reasons in general should also be able to understand moral reasons in particular. But this is not clear if it's always the case. So if someone cannot understand or appreciate the force of moral reason, does that mean that they are off the hook? You know, they are, are they off the hook from moral criticism? Well, if we limit moral criticism to the second point, then no, since the second point argues that moral criticism demands or asks something from the people criticized. It demands that they understand moral reason and change their behavior accordingly. But if they cannot understand moral reason, then moral criticism is unjustified. Like their fault is not due to a mistake in their judgment or that they fail to see a certain relevant moral consideration. They're just incapable of doing so. For these people, asking them to defend their judgment-sensitive attitudes is like asking from someone to defend their their eye colors or their height, for example. But since moral criticism isn't just about this demand, we can say that such people are still open to moral criticism because, as Scanlon writes, from the fact that such acts of criticism would be unreasonable, it would not follow that the criticism they express is unreasonable or unjustified. Nor, as I have argued, does it follow that it is inappropriate or unfair to treat the person differently because of the attitude he holds. And so, like we said earlier, we can avoid such people. We just don't have to be resentful towards them or cause them harm gratuitously or unjustly. We can understand that it is not their fault, but we can find reasons to keep our distances. It's just that our reasons for treating them in that way will need further justification than their inability to understand moral reasoning. All right, so now we can get to the conclusion of the 6th chapter of What We Owe to Each Other by TM Scanlon. So to recap, the point of responsibility is to see whether someone is open to moral criticism. If someone cannot be held responsible for their action, then it is inappropriate to subject them to moral appraisal. And so one thing that makes someone responsible for their action is the ability to choose what one does, and we've seen why people would want to have choices. We call this the choice value, the value of choice theory, and explained why choice is valuable. So if we want to have choices, which obviously we do, then we have to be responsible for them. But we've seen that there are two types of responsibility: attributive responsibility and substantive responsibility. And so the first implies, the first simply argues that someone is responsible for an action if that action is attributable to them. And so to do that, we simply see if the action is aligned with the person's judgment-sensitive attitude. If it is, then it means that the person can understand moral reasoning, and so we can demand of him to modify that behavior if, the action or the behavior is wrong. The second type of responsibility argues that someone is responsible if they can't complain of the burden that the action puts on them. To see if that's the case, we look at whether the agent has the opportunity to do otherwise. If they didn't have the opportunity, then they cannot be held responsible for what they did. And so Scanlon defends the first type of responsibility while kind of rejecting the second. We've seen with the example of the willing addict by Frankfurt that just because you didn't have the opportunity not to be an addict, it doesn't mean that you are not eligible for moral criticism. And so what we are exempted for, however, are the consequences of that moral criticism in the sense of a sanction. The problem with the substantive responsibility we've seen is that it confuses the moral criticism with inflicting burden on the person being criticized. Once we make that distinction, we can say that the addict is responsible for his actions insofar as we can attribute them to him, meaning that his addiction stems from a judgment-sensitive attitude, but that doesn't mean that we blame him for it in the sense of sanctioning the person. Sure, we can avoid that person. We can be even violent with them if they assault us to take our money, to buy drugs. We can lock them up in rehab centers against their will, but we do it without retributive intentions. Like, we are not trying to get back at them. We understand what the person is going through, but there is nothing we can do except avoid them or restrain them like we would do with an animal that just went rogue. And so another problem of this kind of responsibility is that once it establishes that the person had the opportunity to do otherwise, then they cannot complain about their situation. If the drug addict had the opportunity to avoid being an addict, then he has to suffer the consequences of being an addict because it would be their fault. This is an argument that we hear a lot in politics, like politicians, because they want to keep a judiciary system that works for their own interests, they argue for a system that makes abstractions of someone's background conditions. They want people to be held responsible in a substantive sense because it's easier to blame them instead of the system for which, from which the politicians profit. So you often had the debate that, on the other hand, you have people who want to deny the responsibility of an agent for their action because they know what is going to happen to them. And on the other hand, you have people who accuse the former side of denying the responsibility and therefore the freedom of choice of the wrongdoer. But as Scanlon says, this debate rests on the mistaken assumption that taking individuals to be responsible for their conduct in the sense of being open to moral criticism, for it requires one also to say that they are responsible for its results in the substantive sense, that is to say, that they are not entitled to any assistance in dealing with these problems. So, this is it in conflict with what we said about us having the right to avoid people who behave badly as a result of a deprived childhood? Some people are afraid of the substantive responsibility argument because if people are blameworthy, they think that it means that they are not entitled to any help from others. But as Lynn Sharpain, another philosopher that Scanlon mentions in a footnote, argues, that's a fallacious argument. Just because someone is responsible for their behavior doesn't mean that they lose their entitlement for support and assistance. Rather, here we're talking about cases in which help itself is impossible, or if help puts an unreasonable burden on the people supposed to provide the help. And so clearly the people who are supposed to provide the help must be professionals in dealing with such cases, people who have the skills, time and resources for such tasks. So even if Scanlon defends a view in which we behave in such a way towards a wrongdoer that would make them even more unhappy, to make them unhappier, the difference in Scanlon's account is that it doesn't argue that the unhappiness produced in the wrongdoer is deserved or a good thing, contrary to other accounts of responsibility. And so in this sense, Scanlon is a revisionist too, because he holds that views of responsibility that argue that it is a good thing for a blameworthy person to suffer are wrong and they need revision. And so our attitudes towards such people are of course shaped by their own behavior and how blameworthy it is. But as Scanlon ends his chapter, on this account, when we criticize someone who has behaved badly, or when we follow a policy that leads to some people's being injured because they have ignored the warnings they were given, we may be correct in feeling that what we do is justified. But we must also recognize that what separates us from such people is not just, as we would like to think, that we behave better and choose more wisely, but also our luck in being the kind of people who respond in these ways. In this respect, our attitude towards those who suffer or I blamed should not be "you asked for this," but rather "there but the grace of God go I." And so that's it for this chapter. Next time we will go through the 7th chapter, which is about promises. And so I hope that these videos are helping you to understand better philosophical texts and make it easier for you to read these books. And yeah, as always, thank you for watching.